Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at something that'll really get you thinking about the world in a whole new way, and that is synchronicity.
Oh, yeah. Synchronicity.
And for this exploration, our guide is F. David Peat's 1987 book called Synchronicity, The Bridge Between Matter and Mind. So get ready for a journey that takes us through science and psychology and even touches on ancient philosophy.
Yeah, and what's great about Pete's approach is he doesn't just present, all these interesting events as just strange happenings. He actually really wants us to reconsider this whole concept of causality, which is like the foundation of how we see the world, and to really think about those deeper connections that might actually be happening behind the scenes.
Okay, let's jump right in. So Pete starts by telling us the story of this young woman, and she experiences these events that don't seem related at all. At first, the smell of a burnt out candle, a phone call about her dad suddenly needing surgery, and later she sees this painting of a wedding that makes her think of her parents' wedding gift. That's like a chain of events, but not your typical cause and effect kind of it.
Exactly. And that's actually how Pete introduces this idea of synchronicity, right? Those meaningful coincidences that you just can't quite explain with our usual explanations. He says that if we just say, oh, these things are just chance happenings, we're missing something really important. That feeling of significance, that connection that goes beyond just probability.
And that brings us to this idea of an apostle connecting principle, right? Like there's some kind of underlying order, a pattern we don't normally see, but we catch glimpses of through these synchronicities. Pete seems to be questioning that reductionist view,
Yeah.
that everything can be explained by just breaking it down into smaller and smaller pieces.
That's it. He argues that while reductionism is really helpful for understanding certain things about the world, it can't account for everything.
Yeah.
Especially when you think about how complex things like life or consciousness or even those events that seem random but have a deep personal meaning to us.
Yeah.
Like Kammerer's concept of seriality.
Oh, yeah, seriality. He illustrates that with that funny anecdote about the plum pudding, right?
Exact.
It's like fate, you can't tell me it's not.
Yeah. Well, it really makes you wonder.
Yeah.
So you have this Monsieur Deschamps and his encounters with plum pudding. It starts when he's a young boy, and he's treated to this plum pudding by a stranger. Years later, he wants some plum pudding at a restaurant. And what do you know, the last one they had was reserved for that same stranger from his childhood.
Go away.
And then years after that, he's at a dinner party, and guess what's on the menu?
Plum pudding, of course.
Plum pudding.
Might be a sign.
What are the chances,
Yeah.
right? It's such a great example of how these clusters of similar events, they just totally defy what we expect from randomness. It makes you think, is there something more going on here?
It really does.
This whole plum pudding thing and other examples of seriality, it points to what Kammerer calls an underlying harmony or mosaic to nature. He's saying there's a connection between these events that seem random, and it hints at a deeper pattern.
Okay, but I know there are some skeptics out there, people who might say, come on, these are just coincidences. Our brains are wired to find patterns even when there aren't any. How does Pete respond to that?
Well, that's where he brings in his discussion of causality.
Mm-hmm.
He uses this analogy of a tennis ball's trajectory to show the problems with that classic linear cause and effect idea, especially when we're talking about complex systems.
A tennis ball? That sounds pretty simple, but I bet there's more to it than meets the eye.
Oh, absolutely. So we might think we can predict where a tennis ball will go based on how hard it's hit and in what direction.
Yeah.
But Pete says that things like air resistance, temperature changes, even something called the Coriolis effect, they all cause little but important deviations.
So even in something as seemingly predictable as a tennis match, there are hidden complexities that make it pretty much impossible to predict exactly what will happen.
Exactly. And if that's true for a tennis ball, think about how much more complex life is with all its unexpected events and how everything's connected.
Yeah.
Are we really in control as much as we think?
Right, so if we can't even account for all the factors involved in where a tennis ball goes, how can we hold on so tightly to this idea that everything happens because of a simple cause and effect? That's where Pete's argument really starts to make sense. It makes you question those assumptions we often take for granted.
He's asking us to consider the possibility that there might be some kind of underlying order, a pattern that connects these events that seem totally separate in a way that actually has meaning. And this is where his exploration of the work of Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli becomes super important. A psychologist diving into the human mind, and a physicist grappling with the mysteries of the quantum world, both fascinated by synchronicity.
That's a fascinating combination. You have Jung exploring synchronicity from this psychological angle, and Pauli looking for a link between physics and our inner experiences. Did they ever actually work together on this?
Oh yeah, they exchanged letters and ideas for years. Pete tells this really interesting story about a moment during a discussion between Jung and Freud. Two giants in the field of psychology.
Oh, yeah, I remember this one. It's almost like a scene from a movie. They're in the middle of this heated debate, and then bam, there's this loud crack, and Jung's huge bookcase just splits right down the middle. Could that have been a physical manifestation of their intellectual break?
It really makes you think about how powerful the unconscious mind could be, right? Pete also talks about Jung's treatment of Pauli, who was going through some tough times personally and having some really intense dreams.
Hmm.
One that stands out is the world clock dream.
Yeah, the world clock with its multiple rhythms and that intricate geometry. What a powerful image.
It represents this idea of a deeper interconnected reality where time and space are not separate but woven together as parts of this single dynamic whole.
It really challenges our linear perception of the world.
It does. And Jung's interpretation of this dream, along with other material from Pauli's unconscious, helped Pauli find a new sense of balance and wholeness. It's amazing how these two seemingly separate fields, psychology and physics, come together when you're exploring synchronicity.
It really is. And what's also interesting is the connection between Pauli's groundbreaking work in physics and his ish in synchronicity. His exclusion principle, which governs how electrons behave in atoms, it actually kind of echoes Jung's ideas about there being a hidden order within those events that seem random.
That's right.
Like there's this parallel between the laws of the tiny world of the atom and the patterns we see in our own lives. Those moments of synchronicity that hint at a deeper connection between our minds and the physical world. Are there other examples from the natural world that point to this idea of an underlying order?
Yeah, Pete shifts gears a bit and looks at this concept of the living universe. He challenges that view that life is just a complicated machine, and he uses this fascinating example of the slime mold to illustrate how collective behavior emerges in living systems.
The slime mold, it can change from these individual amoebas that act on their own to a unified slug that moves and acts as one being. How does that fit into the living universe idea?
It's a perfect example of how individual things can come together and create something bigger than themselves. The slime mold shows us that this kind of emergent collective behavior isn't only found as living things, but also in matter that we think of as inanimate.
It makes you think about those times in society where people's individual actions, even if they seem unconnected, can come together and create these bigger movements, like a hidden force is drawing everything together.
Exactly, and Pete uses examples from physics to make this point. Things like superconducting electrons lasers and these things called Barnard convection cells, they all show these global cooperative behaviors that pop up in different physical systems, and they all point to an underlying, a causal connecting principle at work, something that goes beyond those simple linear cause and effect explanations.
So he's suggesting that the universe isn't just a bunch of separate parts, but a unified whole where connections and patterns emerge from a deeper level of reality. And that deeper level is what we're trying to tap into when we talk about synchronicity, right?
That's it. And that leads us to Pete's chapter on patterns in the bone, where he explores how our tendency as humans to recognize and create patterns, it goes beyond just the physical world. It extends into the realm of meaning and symbolism.
How does he connect those two seemingly different ideas?
He starts by talking about the Naskapi people of Labrador and their rituals of bone oracle divination. For them, the patterns and cracks in the caribou's shoulder bone after it's been heated, they're messages from the animal's spirit guiding them in the hunt and in life.
So for the Naskapi, these patterns aren't just random, they're messages. It's so fascinating how a culture's whole worldview can be so tied to their understanding of patterns and synchronicity in nature.
And then Pete connects this to the ancient Chinese practice of bone oracle divination used by the Shang dynasty. And there's some really interesting parallels between these two traditions. It shows how humans across cultures have always been fascinated by finding hidden patterns and meaning in things that seem random.
Yeah, we see it in the Naskapi bone oracles, the Shang dynasty divinations, and even today in our interest in things like astrology and tarot. It's like this deep human need to make sense of the world, to find meaning and connection in events that might seem chaotic and random otherwise.
Exactly, and that's a perfect lead-in to Pete's exploration of the I Ching, which he describes as a timeless system of synchronicity, a system that's both divination and philosophy all in one.
The I Ching, or Book of Changes, has captivated people across cultures and throughout time. For those who aren't familiar, it basically provides this framework for understanding how forces interact dynamically in the universe and within ourselves.
Yes.
It's all based on a system of hexagrams, right?
Yes, 64 unique hexagrams, each with its own meaning and interpretation. They're formed by different combinations of solid and broken lines representing the fundamental forces of yin and yang. And, Carl Jung is really fascinated by the I Ching. He saw it as aligning with his theories of synchronicity and the collective unconscious.
It's like he's saying that the way those hexagrams are generated, seemingly randomly, can actually give us insights into the hidden patterns that connect events in a person's life and the world around them. It's a system that encourages you to see those connections, those subtle patterns that you might not notice otherwise.
And then Pete gets into this really intriguing concept called morphic fields, proposed by the biologist Rupert Sheldrake. These fields are thought to act as a kind of memory for both material structures and behavior, almost like a blueprint that influences how things take shape.
Instead of saying that the shape of a crystal or the way a bird behaves is just determined by genes and physical laws, Sheldrake suggests that there's this non-physical field, a morphic field, that guides their development. That's a pretty mind-bending concept.
It really is. And what's especially relevant to our discussion of synchronicity is this idea that information could be transmitted across space and time through these fields. It's a potential explanation for those non-local influences that Pete associates with synchronicity.
So our thoughts, feelings, and even intentions could be leaving traces in these morphic fields, affecting not just our own experiences, but possibly even those of others across great distances. It really makes you wonder about the true nature of interconnectedness.
Doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea, isn't it? That we're not just these isolated individuals, but part of a larger web of consciousness, all connected and sharing information and experiences maybe across time and space through these morphic fields. Maybe synchronicity is like a way for this interconnectedness to show up in our lives.
It definitely gives us a whole new way of looking at things. Instead of seeing ourselves as separate from the world around us, we can start to see those connections, those patterns that tie our inner and outer worlds together. But how does this fit in with what science tells us about things like the second law of thermodynamics? Doesn't that law suggest that everything's moving towards chaos and disorder?
That's a pretty common misunderstanding, actually. While the second law does say that entropy tends to increase in closed systems, the universe as a whole, it's not really a closed system. It's always changing, evolving with new structures and patterns coming out of what might seem like chaos. Think of it like a garden. If you don't take care of it, it might seem to get all overgrown and wild. But even in all that apparent disorder, there's new life constantly popping up, interacting, and creating this complex ecosystem.
Okay, I see that analogy, but how does this idea of order coming out of chaos connect to synchronicity? Are you saying that these meaningful coincidences are a way for the universe to fight back against entropy?
That's an interesting thought. Pete doesn't say that directly, but he does talk about the work of Ilya Prigogine. He's a Nobel Prize-winning chemist who studied how order emerges from chaos in something called dissipative structures.
Dissipative structures, that name sounds intriguing. What does it mean?
Imagine a pot of water simmering on a stove as the water gets hotter. You see this distinct pattern, those hexagonal convection cells where the hotter water rises in the middle and the cooler water flows down around the edges. It's a beautiful example of how order just spontaneously arises from what seems like random movement.
Oh, that's a great visual. So even though entropy might be increasing overall, you can still have these little pockets of order popping up and hanging around. It's like the universe is finding ways to create complexity and beauty, even within a system that seems to be governed by laws leading towards disorder. Could this be how synchronicity works too?
That's a compelling idea, and Pete doesn't just stick to physical systems like boiling water. He also talks about biological systems like that slime mold we talked about, and even plasma, which is the most common state of matter in the universe. He's arguing that all these examples challenge that reductionist viewpoint, that we can understand everything by just breaking it down into its tiniest parts.
He's saying the whole is more than just the sum of its parts. That these emergent properties, these new patterns of organization, they can't be predicted or understood just by looking at the individual components. It's a perspective that really recognizes how interconnected and complex the universe is.
Precisely. He's suggesting there's some kind of creative principle at work in the universe, a principle that allows for novelty complexity, meaning to emerge even in systems that are governed by laws that seem to lead to disorder.
And this idea of a creative principle ties in really well with another big idea in Pete's book, nonlinearity. How does this idea relate to our understanding of synchronicity and this interconnected universe?
Nonlinearity, as the word suggests, means that there isn't always a direct proportional relationship between cause and effect. In a linear system, a small change in input results in a predictable proportional change in output. But the universe is full of feedback loops, interconnectedness, emergent properties that defy these simple expectations.
It's like setting off a chain reaction of dominoes. We might think we can predict what will happen based on that first push, but in a complex system, there are so many variables at play that unexpected things can happen. One domino might fall a little differently and change the whole course of the chain.
Exactly. Peat argues that most natural systems, including life itself, are nonlinear. This means that even small changes could have massive, unpredictable effects. Think about the butterfly effect. The idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil could theoretically trigger a chain of events that leads to a hurricane in Florida. It shows just how interconnected these seemingly unrelated events can be.
So in a nonlinear system, it's basically impossible to predict the long-term consequences of even the tiniest actions. It really highlights how interconnected everything is and how even those events that seem insignificant can have these ripple effects that go far beyond what we might expect.
And if the universe is fundamentally nonlinear, then maybe synchronicity, those seemingly improbable coincidences that have this deep meaning for us, maybe they're not so improbable after all. They could be expressions of that deeper interconnectedness and those patterns that are just inherent in a nonlinear system.
It brings us back to that idea of emergence we talked about earlier. If the universe is always evolving, generating new forms and patterns out of what appears to be chaos, then maybe synchronicity is one way that this creative process shows up in our lives.
It's a fascinating perspective. Pete challenges us to go beyond just linear thinking and embrace a more holistic view of the universe where mind and matter aren't these separate things, but interconnected aspects of a single dynamic reality.
And this reminds me of how Pete talks about how our brains are naturally wired to look for patterns, even in data that seems random. He says that we experience the world as a whole before our minds start to categorize and analyze everything. It's like a state of pure perception, where we might be most open to those subtle patterns and synchronicities that connect us to something bigger than ourselves.
He uses this powerful metaphor to illustrate this point, patterns in the bone. He goes back to the example of the Naskapi people of Labrador and their bone oracle divination rituals, where the patterns they find in these heated caribou bones are interpreted as messages from the animal spirits guiding their hunts and their lives.
It's so interesting how they find meaning and guidance in these cracks and lines that seem random. And Pete connects this to the ancient Chinese practice of bone oracle divination used by the Shang dynasty. He emphasizes how both of these cultures developed these complex systems for making meaning out of the patterns they found in bones.
These practices weren't just about predicting the future. They were about aligning themselves with the rhythms of nature, the deeper patterns that connect us to something beyond just ourselves.
It's like they were tapping into a deeper level of reality, a realm of meaning and symbolism that goes beyond the material world. And they use these patterns in the bones as a way to access this realm to find guidance, and understanding it makes you wonder if we've lost touch with this innate ability to connect with the deeper patterns of the universe.
Maybe we have to some extent,
Yeah.
but we still see echoes of this deep human need to find meaning in events that seem random in our modern fascination with things like astrology, tarot, numerology, even the patterns we find in data and statistics.
It all points back to this inherent desire we have to connect the dots, to see the patterns that might suggest there's an underlying order to the universe. And maybe if we're open to it, synchronicity is one way that this underlying order reveals itself to us through those meaningful coincidences that make us wonder if there's more to reality than what we see on the surface.
And speaking of finding meaning, Pete goes deeper into the ancient Chinese system of the I Ching, which he calls a timeless system of synchronicity. We touched on it briefly before, but how does the I Ching fit into this idea of patterns and meaningful coincidences?
The I Ching is a truly unique system. It's like a blend of divination, philosophy, and psychology. It's based on this idea that the universe is constantly in flux with yin and yang, those complementary forces interacting to create change and transformation.
And those changes are represented through the system of 64 hexagrams, each one made up of 6 lines, either solid or broken. These lines represent the interplay of yin and yang. They're generated either randomly, like through tossing coins or yarrow stalks, or by other means, and the way they're arranged offers insight into the current state of a situation and how it might develop in the future.
So if I were to consult the I Ching about a specific situation in my life, the hexagram I get wouldn't necessarily tell me exactly what's going to happen, but it would give me some insight into the underlying patterns and energies at play, maybe highlighting potential challenges or opportunities that I might not be aware of.
That's the key to understanding the I Ching. It's not about fortune telling. It's about gaining a deeper understanding of the forces that are shaping our lives and how we might align ourselves with those forces to create a more harmonious outcome.
It's fascinating how Pete draws parallels between the I Ching with its ancient roots in Chinese philosophy and modern scientific concepts like nonlinearity and complexity theory. It's like he's suggesting that these ancient systems of wisdom might hold insights that are still relevant even in our modern scientific worldview.
Absolutely. Pete argues that both science and these ancient traditions are at their core attempts to understand the universe, to uncover those hidden patterns and connections that give meaning to our lives. And maybe synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences that seem to defy our rational explanations, is a bridge between these two worldviews.
A bridge between ancient wisdom and modern science. That's a powerful image. And it brings us back to one of the main questions Pete explores in his book, The Relationship Between Mind and Matter. He challenges that traditional dualistic view that sees these two realms as separate and argues for a more holistic understanding. And this is where the concept of morphic fields, those invisible blueprints proposed by Rupert Sheldrake, comes back into play, right?
Exactly. Sheldrake suggests these fields act like a kind of non-physical template guiding the development of form and behavior in both living and non-living systems. Think of it like this. Every snowflake is unique, but they all have that similar six-sided structure. Could that be the influence of a morphic field?
So instead of saying that the shape of a snowflake or even the instinctive behavior of a bird is solely determined by genes or physical laws, Sheldrake is proposing that there's this non-physical field influencing how those forms and behaviors manifest.
Precisely, and what's really fascinating is that these morphic fields are thought to have a kind of memory. Every time a form or behavior is repeated, it strengthens the associated morphic field, making it more likely to occur again in the future. So in a way, we're all contributing to this collective memory.
So learning and evolution aren't just about genetic changes, but also about these non-physical morphic fields constantly being shaped by the experiences of all organisms and even inanimate systems that share those forms and behaviors.
Exactly. It's a pretty radical concept, but it has some profound implications. Think about it this way. If you were to teach a dog a new trick, Sheldrake would say that you're not just teaching that one dog, you're also subtly influencing the morphic field associated with that behavior, making it a little bit easier for other dogs to learn that same trick in the future.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. It's like we're all contributing to this pool of knowledge and experience, not just through what we do, but through our thoughts, feelings, and intentions. Could synchronicity be a way that this collective knowledge reveals itself to us through those meaningful coincidences that seem guided by something beyond our conscious awareness?
It's an intriguing possibility, isn't it? Pete explores how these morphic fields could provide a framework for understanding those non-local influences that he links to synchronicity. Maybe those moments when we experience those meaningful connections across time and space. They're not just random events, but expressions of the interconnectedness that's inherent in these fields.
It challenges our understanding of how information travels. Instead of seeing our minds as these isolated entities, we can start to see them as constantly interacting with this larger field of information and consciousness, a field that we might be able to tap into through practices like meditation, intuition, or just by paying attention to those moments of synchronicity that make us question the limits of our everyday perception.
And Pete goes even further. He suggests that morphic fields could offer a new perspective on the relationship between mind and matter. He proposes that matter isn't just this inert stuff, but at its core, it's a patterned flow of information. And this idea resonates with what modern physics is discovering, which is increasingly suggesting that the universe is more like a vast network of information than a collection of solid objects.
So instead of seeing the world as made up of these separate things, we can start to see it as this dynamic interplay of patterns and information with mind and matter as different expressions of this underlying reality. It's a radical shift in perspective, one that opens up a whole new way of understanding ourselves and our place in the universe. And if we embrace this more holistic view, maybe synchronicity becomes less of a mystery and more of a natural expression of the interconnectedness and meaningful patterns that are woven through all levels of reality.
That's a great point. It's not about trying to force synchronicity into a neat little box. It's about expanding our understanding of how the universe works to include the possibilities of non-local connections, causal influences, and the active role of consciousness in shaping reality.
That takes us into the fascinating world of quantum physics, which challenges those classical ideas we have about causality and determinism. Peat talks about how quantum phenomena like wave-particle duality, superposition, and entanglement all suggest that reality isn't as fixed and predictable as we might think. Even the act of observation in quantum physics is thought to influence the outcome of an experiment, suggesting there's this deep connection between mind and matter.
It's like the universe isn't this predetermined machine, but more like this dynamic participatory process where our choices and observations actually play a role in shaping the reality that we experience.
Exactly, and Pete draws these really interesting parallels between these insights from quantum physics and the concept of synchronicity, suggesting that both point to a reality that's more fluid and interconnected than our classical models can explain. Instead of trying to squeeze synchronicity into our existing framework of linear causality, maybe we need to expand our understanding of how the universe operates.
Yeah, it's almost like we're being asked to consider a universe where meaning and purpose aren't just things that humans made up, but are actually woven into the very fabric of reality. Could those moments of meaningful coincidence, those synchronicities, be glimpses into this deeper order, invitations to pay attention to those subtle connections that link our inner and outer worlds?
Pete definitely seems to think so. He encourages us to move beyond that purely mechanistic view of the universe where everything is predetermined and predictable, and instead he proposes a more holistic perspective that acknowledges the roles of consciousness, meaning, and interconnectedness. It's a perspective that we see throughout history, from those ancient wisdom traditions to the insights of modern physics and depth psychology, and maybe by exploring these mysteries of synchronicity, we can start to bridge the gap between these seemingly different ways of understanding the universe.
Yeah, and Pete suggests that one way to bridge this gap is by looking at our understanding of causality in a new way. He points out that our typical linear view of cause and effect, while it's helpful for explaining certain things, it's limited when we try to understand those complex systems like living organisms, the human mind, or even the universe as a whole.
So instead of seeing the universe as this chain of isolated events where each one is caused by the one before it, he's asking us to consider the possibility of a causal connecting principle, a principle that operates beyond the limits of time and space linking events in a way that makes sense but goes against our linear expectations. It's a tough concept to grasp, but one that could completely change how we see ourselves and our place in the cosmos.
It really does challenge our usual way of thinking. If synchronicity is real, if those meaningful coincidences aren't just random happenings, then it suggests that there's some kind of deeper intelligence at work, a subtle guidance that we might be able to tune into.
That makes me think about intuition, that gut feeling that sometimes guides us in ways that we can't really explain logically. Could intuition be a way of tapping into this a causal connecting principle, a way of sensing that interconnectedness that Pete describes?
It's a really interesting question, and while P doesn't go too deep into the nature of intuition, his exploration of synchronicity definitely leaves that possibility open. Maybe those times when we have a strong intuitive feeling about something, a hunch that turns out to be right. They aren't just lucky guesses. Maybe there are moments where we've caught a glimpse of those underlying patterns and connections that are shaping our lives.
Like, we've tuned into a frequency that we don't normally have access to, a frequency that carries information about the past, present, and future, and we experience it as this flash of insight, this gut feeling that guides us in ways that defy rational explanation.
And Pete encourages us to pay attention to those moments of synchronicity, to notice the patterns and connections that we might otherwise miss. He suggests that by becoming more aware of these synchronicities, we could start to develop a more intuitive understanding of the universe and our place in it.
So instead of just dismissing those meaningful coincidences as pure chance, we can start to see them as possible messages, signposts pointing us toward a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. What a profound shift in perspective.
It really is. Pete's book is like an invitation to cultivate a sense of wonder, to embrace the mysteries of the universe, and to recognize that we're not separate from, but deeply interconnected with that web of life and consciousness that's all around us.
As we wrap up our deep dive into synchronicity, it's clear that Pete's book raises more questions than it answers, but maybe that's the whole point. It's not about giving us all the answers, but about inviting us to explore the mysteries of the universe with a fresh sense of curiosity, openness, and wonder.
And maybe, just maybe, by opening ourselves up to the possibility of synchronicity, by paying attention to those meaningful coincidences that defy those rational explanations, we can start to see a deeper truth about the nature of reality and our place in it.
So to our listeners out there, as you go about your day, we encourage you to pay attention to those moments that make you stop and think, those seemingly random encounters, those unexpected connections, those synchronicities that make you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. Perhaps they're glimpses into a deeper order, invitations to explore the mysteries of the universe, and to discover the interconnectedness that binds us all.
Yeah, and as you continue your own exploration, remember what Pete says about embracing a more holistic view of the universe, one where mind and matter aren't separate but intertwined aspects of this single dynamic reality.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into synchronicity. We hope it sparked your curiosity and inspired you to look for those meaningful coincidences that enrich your life and deepen your understanding of the universe and your place in it.